Hi there. So, searching ancestors with a common surname, it's one of the most common problems when carrying out ancestry research, which is when the line or lines you are researching have a really common surname. I seem to have been doing quite a lot of that recently. As a professional genealogist, my heart sinks when I'm asked to research a Smith or a Jones, or whenever this name pops up in a marriage record. But even names that you might think of as fairly unusual can be surprisingly numerous in certain areas. My own surname, Bott, may sound very uncommon, but it was once a very common name in Staffordshire, which is where my ancestors came from. And it can be extremely frustrating to try and sift through all the possible search results and try to identify which one is your ancestor. Quite often, even with a common name, you can still find the right family back to the early 19th century, as the census records will give you specific facts such as place of birth, occupation, and so on, that can help you identify one person from another. But once you get beyond the census, common name ancestors can become a bit of a nightmare to research. First of all, though, let's start with the 19th century. Even with the census, results can be confusing, and it's really important with any research, but particularly with common names, that you look in detail at every single document you can find. So if you are having difficulty, make sure you order those birth and marriage certificates that you can find. Don't just look at the index entries, and don't just look at a few census records. Look at every single census record that you can find for all the ancestors you know about through their lifetimes. Some census records can give you extra clues. So make a note if your ancestor has any middle names or initials in any of those records. Very often these will get dropped in most records, but sometimes you will find that the full name is given in the baptism or birth record. Make a note of every single person in the household, even if they are lodgers or boarders who appear to be strangers. Sometimes these can turn out to be family members, perhaps related to the wife of the head of household, which can then help you to identify a correct marriage. Make notes of all the family members on the page on every census record, their ages and places of birth. You might get lucky and find that in one census record they had a parent or grandparent staying with them, or perhaps an aunt or a brother or a sister, or perhaps even a nephew. If you've had trouble finding a baptism for your direct ancestor, then searching for these other family members can help you to identify the correct family in the baptism records. Occupations can certainly help, although it was very common for a person to change jobs, especially in the poorer classes where they were taking what job they could. Or in other occupations, it could be that they were working in the same industry, but moving up the ladder, so to speak. So if you're unable to find your person, say, in the earlier census records with the same occupation as they had later on, then look for something similar or the same industry. For example, my grandfather, who was alive in the late 19th to early 20th century, was a railway goods clerk in later records, and as my mother remembers. But he started out at the age of 15 as a cart boy for the same railway. What can make things worse is when your ancestor not only has a common surname, but also a common first name. This is where finding other family members on the census can really help. But also look at the names of their children. Any unusual first names in siblings can be easier to research, and children are often named after parents, grandparents, or brothers and sisters. naming patterns become even more important as we go beyond the census, and where the research gets a lot more difficult. Much more than today, people usually named children after themselves, their parents, and their own siblings. It's not always the case, but it can help, and you'll find the same names come up time and time again in the same family. So while you are researching baptisms and coming up with too many results, then look at the names of the parents and other children to see whether these names are reflected in your ancestors' children. For this reason, I always, when finding a baptism, look at all of the other children of a given couple. And this is a step that amateur genealogists sometimes don't bother to do, but it is extremely important. The names of siblings can be essential in finding the right family. And also the dates of the first and last children can help you to find the correct marriage for the parents and burial or death records of the parents. When you're carrying out your research, keep a map handy. When I'm researching, I always have Google Maps open on my computer so I can see exactly where each parish is and how close they are to each other. Families did move around in the 18th century and earlier, but usually not very far. So the closer a baptism is to where you find them later, the more likely it is to be your ancestor. But of course, this has to be matched with other criteria, such as naming patterns, etc. I also strongly suggest using more than one search tool. If you are just using ancestry.co.uk, then I would suggest also subscribing to Find My Past. Their search tool is very different. And what I like about Find My Past is that you can put in a sliding area range. So you can start off researching an exact parish or town and then extend the area search to 10 miles at a time. I find this much more useful than the rather hit and miss system on Ancestry. Don't forget too that not every baptism or marriage is on both websites. You will sometimes find a baptism on one that is not on the other, so I do recommend using both websites. Once you've searched all the possible baptism, marriage and burial records and you are still finding it difficult to sort out which of the results are your ancestors, then it's time to search for other records. You can try doing a search all records on both Ancestry and Find My Past, which should bring up other documents if available, such as perhaps criminal records, settlement records, etc. And in the case of wealthier ancestors, wills and land records. If you know at least the parish or specific area your ancestor came from, you could try searching for any wills with the same surname within that area, just to see if your direct ancestor is mentioned in any of them, which would give you their relationship to that person. This can be difficult, particularly if you can't read old handwriting, but worth a try if you can learn how to do this or find someone who can transcribe them for you. After that, you can search what documents are in offline archives. You can do this by searching the Discovery page on the National Archives website, which will bring up documents that are either at the National Archives at Kew or at local record offices across the country. The search tool on the National Archives is not my favourite, and it doesn't allow for different spelling, so you do need to make sure you've put in all the various spellings, which can take a while to do the research. For this reason, I also find it useful to go to the website of the relevant county record offices and search their online catalogues. While the National Archives should bring these up, sometimes, due to different spellings or other criteria, you can find something there that you haven't seen before. Now, if after all this you are still finding it difficult to identify your ancestor, then sometimes it might be useful to trace all the different possibilities back and see if they link up at any stage. Sometimes you might find that 2 or 3 people of the same age and name were actually cousins and shared a grandparent or great-grandparent. So at least you can get back onto the right line, even if you're unsure which of the cousins is your direct ancestor. Sometimes, and sadly quite often, your research will come to a grinding halt around the 18th century. If your ancestor came into the parish from somewhere far away, without a census or other records to say where, it can be impossible to go further unless they had a very unusual first name, for example. In this case, you will just have to park this line and decide to work on other and easier lines of your family tree. Sometimes we just have to accept that a line just comes to a dead end. Most of us have one of these in our family tree, so don't be too disheartened. I do know how frustrating it is, but if you have carried out all of the steps above, then at least you know you've done everything possible. So I hope this has helped any of you who have come across this frustrating problem. Do ask me any questions you have and I will try to answer them in a future video. So good luck with your searches and bye for now.